Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, a podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm an investigative journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are economists, scientists, politicians, journalists, academics, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, and ecological crises we face today and reveal their solutions to mitigate the damage to our future. This is a critical time for our planet. It demands critical thinking. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. On today's show is journalist and author Paul Greenberg. Paul joined me to discuss, initially he joined me to discuss fish, but we ended up talking about everything from nuclear fusion to climate obesity, i.e. which countries are guilty of consuming more energy than others, the Protestant Reformation as a template for the kind of radical change that our society requires. And then eventually back to fish. Paul has written some fantastic books on the climate crisis and is very well known for his work on the oceans, fish life, and on the kind of seafood diets that could sustainably support both the industry and our protein needs. He also recently wrote a book called The Climate Diet, 50 steps that individuals can take to reduce their energy consumption and to mitigate their effect on the planet. It was so much fun speaking with Paul. I really think that you're going to enjoy this. We cover a variety of topics as journalists tend to when they're together. And what we circle around frequently is the question of responsibility. Whose job is it to make the most radical change? And how we can take the most effective decisions as quickly as possible. Paul, I'm really thrilled to have you on the show. Thank you for joining me.
No, my pleasure, Rachel.
You've written books, you write for the New York Times, you're an expert in fish, which is not something you often get to say about somebody.
I often say that I'm not famous, but I am fish famous.
I'm sure if fish could talk, they would thank you for drawing so much attention to their crisis. Let's get into it a little bit.
Yeah.
Why fish?
Well, so I grew up with as a divorced kid, or rather a child of divorced parents. Very early on, my parents split, and my father was very much a kind of, he's almost like a stereotype of like a Woody Allen Upper West Side New York City psychiatrist, and
Okay.
didn't know the first thing really. I don't know how it is in the UK, but back in the 70s, most fathers didn't know much about fathering, or at
Mhm.
least, full-time fathering. So I think when my parents divorced, my father had it in his mind that a father should take his son fishing. Not that
Right.
he
Okay.
not that he knew how to fish. Uh, but kids go where you point them to some degree, and not some people, I mean, this relates to the larger question of sort of the human relationship to the planet. But I've always had this theory that about 10% of the population has the hunter gatherer gene still alive in them. And, there are various theories about how Western civilization arose. And one theory is that the Indo Europeans swept over Neolithic Europe and pushed the original hunter gatherers to the far corner. One argument is that the Basque language is actually so different from the rest of the European languages because it's an original fossil. It's a hunter gatherer
Mm.
language that precedes all their languages. Um, so there was, of course, interbreeding between the Indo Europeans and the resident hunter gatherers. My pet theory is that there's 10% of the gene pool is hunter gatherer, and that gene surfaces periodically. I know it's a lot of genetic determinism. And you'll find people that I always find when I teach kids how to fish, there are some kids who are just totally lock and load on it and are totally into it. And there are other kids, my own son included, that just have no interest in it whatsoever.
Mm.
And so for me, I was one of those lock and load kids. And that was how I came to really love the natural world, was not just sort of looking at it through binoculars, but by participating as a predator, if you will. And,
I mean,
I mean,
there is that irony in what you're saying. I came to love the natural world
yes,
by,
but
fishing fish
yeah,
out of
yeah,
their
yeah, yeah.
natural habitat.
Well, I mean, and I think, to some degree, have you seen the film Seaspiracy?
I got about a quarter of the way through it, and then
I watched it
yeah.
on 1.5 times speed. and it was fine.
Yeah.
Um, but that film, I think, regardless of what you or I might have invested in terms of viewing time, it was very well watched. I mean, it was
Mhm,
of all the fishy stuff that I've seen come out in the number last few years. But the message that you walk away from that film with is don't eat fish and
mhm,
don't basically be a vegan, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but there's a kind of sort of passive spec spectator like quality I feel to the kind of modern urban vegan who doesn't want to touch anything to do with actual physical nature and just sort of has like scrolling through their Instagram and looking at beautiful pictures of nature, but is not
mm.
necessarily actively participating in the drama that is life. So I certainly take the killing of anything seriously. And I certainly reformed the way I fish in my lifetime, especially in the last 10 years. But I think to kind of just step back from the relationship with the natural world entirely and just make it a kind of a viewing symposium perhaps misses something along the way. So, I mean, I wouldn't go to the wall to defend fishing. I certainly can see why, if all of us were truly going to be vegans and we were truly, but at the same time, ready to kind of physically participate in the natural world and defend it and do all those kinds of things, great. But my guess is that the majority of the people who kind of step away from, I don't know, fishing or hunting or whatever, are really passive observers of nature rather than active participants.
This is interesting because the other thing that you write about is like technological alienation, right?
Yeah.
How people are, yeah, becoming more and more dissociated from the natural world, and through. I read an article that you wrote about concrete and steel and phones as well. So I'm glad that you've kind of brought this up because I was most interested actually in the intersection of all of your interests.
Yep.
And certainly, I think what we have seen with veganism is like a really brilliant impetus and desire to change and a willingness as well because veganism is hard. I mean, it demands a certain financial status, but it demands time and energy and research. So hats off to people that are willing to make changes.
Yeah.
um but what we've seen instead is people go, okay, well, it's animal agriculture that's a problem, so I'll stop with that. But then deforestation in Brazil increases because almond milk and soy milk and all these things. So it doesn't really attack the problem of like industrialization and globalization and inequity in supply chains,
Yeah.
and consumption essentially. And one of the things I was really fascinated by Attenborough's documentary last year, the one about climate change, even though it wasn't quite titled that, um, was the one thing that he said: if we free up more of the coastline for wildlife and designate certain fishing areas and keep them quite small and then distribute fish a little bit more fairly and reduce food waste, then we can actually eat fish sustainably. And that's the one form of animal that we can continue with. And I find that really, really interesting and surprising.
So I haven't seen the Edinburgh documentary, but I will say that, in my book, The Climate Diet, I do point out that when you, and keep in mind that life cycle analyses um, of different foodstuffs are always tricky. But
Hmm.
I think I did my due diligence and I talked to a number of people who look at the carbon footprint of fish. And when you're talking about wild fish, the carbon footprint is actually quite low.
Mm.
Um, why? Well, a wild creature, first of all, doesn't require human husbandry to bring it to market. So, all of that stuff like feeding and tending and so forth, that's just happens through natural processes. The only thing that is expensive from a carbon perspective with fish is the fishing method. And there are different fish that cost us different amounts of carbon depending on how carbon intensive the harvesting method is. Like dragging the bottom of the seafloor for
Mm.
place or sole is going to be carbon intensive. However, a midwater trawl where the net doesn't actually touch the bottom for something, say, like herring or mackerel, is extremely carbon efficient. And so, in that sense, I do agree with Attenborough. Um, I think that ocean systems can be tremendously, tremendously productive. We are often trying to superimpose a terrestrial model on the sea and try to make it seem as if they're somehow comparable. The one thing I will always point out is that up until recently, there was basically no construction in the ocean. That we weren't physically occupying ocean
Mm,
spaces. So there's no competition for habitat like we have on land. There's no
mhm,
subdivisions going into the ocean. So in that sense, yes, there's the potential to have, a still largely wild ocean. At the same time, there are all sorts of competing interests, including from the renewable energy sector, that are competing for ocean space. Like I'm just
mm.
working on a story right now about the competition between Maine lobstermen, um, Maine being in the northern part of the United States, and wind farms that are about to go in big time. And you must know
Oh,
about the wind farm
wow.
situation up in your part of the world.
I think I know just about the same as a layman
Hmm.
on wind farms. I know that they're not quite as efficient as one would hope for.
Yeah.
And the amount of materials that it takes to create one is really quite distressing.
It is, and I mean, it's funny. I spoke to so the story that I'm working on right now. Um, they're putting in a test array off of the Gulf of Maine, and unlike in the UK, like the UK already has substantial wind farm in operation off of the southeast, and also off of Scotland, where you're from.
Mm,
And increasingly, those are getting larger and larger. I always, as an environmentalist, always figured that renewables at all costs, that's what we need. But what was interesting, once you start to delve into it, is that, as you point out, the materials are expensive to obtain and to build. um, the servicing of these of the windmills is required. I was talking to a UK fisherman about this, and I was saying, has anything good come out of wind farms for you? And he said, well, we do actually sell quite a bit of petrol to the wind farm operators to go back and forth to
yeah,
the wind
yeah,
farms.
yeah, of
Um,
course.
and then there's other interesting things. I mean, and again, I don't want to say that I'm not anti-wind farm because again, where is this power going to come from? But there are there hasn't been a lot of science put into the before and after effects of putting in a large amount of structure into the ocean. Because keep in mind, it's
Mm,
not just the wind turn, it's just not just the blades turning, but there's a huge amount of power lines, all sorts of infrastructure that have to go along the sea floor to conduct all that electricity back to shore.
mm.
What the impact of that is, from electromagnetic vibration to all these kinds of things, we still don't quite know.
Have there been any studies done?
Yeah, yeah.
What are the results?
There haven't been a whole lot of studies.
Mm,
The I think the best that I can tell, and I'm still in the middle of the story, so I
mm,
can't quite give you a firm answer on that. But what was interesting was talking with the wind developer in the Gulf of Maine, who seems like a pretty straightforward environmental kind of guy. He was like, I was like, am I right that there really hasn't been a lot of before or after studies in Europe? And this is a guy who has a vested interest in developing wind farms. He's like, you're right. There really hasn't been a lot of before and after. And the thing is, there's a lot of money there, right? And
yeah.
there's a lot of big European and Asian companies that stand to make quite a bit of money. So there's not a whole lot of interest in doing deep studies. And now that,
Mm,
it's particularly in Europe, now that governments are invested, they've made commitments, they've said they're going to achieve carbon neutrality by a certain date. The biggest form of putting on the balance sheet of getting to carbon zero, to net zero, it is going to be offshore wind by and large, unless something else comes along like nuclear fusion, like perhaps tidal energy, things like that. But for the moment, the technology that exists that can produce the most megawatts is going to be offshore wind.
I'm really lucky. I do get sort of climate scientists on the show quite frequently.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, first of all, net zero, pipe dream,
Hmm.
wrong goal. Second of all, the reason that we use fossil fuel is it's because it is the most efficient fuel on the planet that we
Hmm.
have found so far.
Right.
Wind, solar, tidal, it just doesn't compare. We
Yep.
cannot generate enough energy using these renewable tools. So
Yeah.
what we need to start doing is focusing on reducing our consumption, but nobody has a vested interest in that.
That's
Because
right.
that you're talking about reducing profit margins.
Right. Right. Well, I remember a number of years ago, now it must be over 20 years now, I read an article in the magazine Harper's, and it was a very early climate change article. And I remember the author saying, couldn't we just throw all of our money at Exxon and Shell and BP and just say, please take all our money, but just convert everything to renewables? We
Mm,
understand that you have the total power monopoly on everything.
mm,
Fine, you can have all our money, but just change.
yeah.
I thought that was sort of an interesting argument at the time. Obviously, it didn't happen, but it does make you want to sort of say that. And to be fair, I mean, or to talk to that, there is, I think some talk about some of these companies that are already doing offshore oil drilling switching over to offshore wind because when you think about it, there's already an experience working offshore like that. So who knows?
Shell's got this whole like sustainability department,
Yeah.
and they're working on nature-based solutions. That's what they call it. So the acronym is NBS. And if you watch any of their like promo videos or even in-house meetings, it's all yeah, this NBS and that NBS and whatever. And it's just wild because like they refer to forests as assets, like
Hmm.
carbon assets. And the way that they talk about the natural world, the way that they're financializing climate change, and also in no way taking responsibility for their part in arriving where we are today. And I don't buy into the narrative of like it's their fault. Every relationship is mutual.
Yeah.
If consumers didn't demand so much, there wouldn't be so much
Yeah.
supply. Um, but just like no, we're here to help. We're gonna provide the solution. So
Yeah.
just stop being
Yeah.
so fucking disingenuous.
No, that's true. At some point, blame has to be placed with somebody, and somebody has to be motivated to make the kind of massive change that has to happen.
Hmm.
And I think what we've seen in the recent COP26 thing that we can't quite figure out where the locus of blame is or
Yeah.
where's the leverage of change. You know what I mean? And I've,
Mm.
spent the previous year writing this whole book about shrinking your own personal carbon footprint. And of course, a lot of people will point to the whole notion of a carbon footprint as being something that came out of the fossil fuel industry
Yeah.
of of that somehow it's all on the individual in order to change things, but at the same time we are just individuals, we are just individual human beings, and to have no responsibility on a personal basis also seems to be wrong. So
Mhm.
just trying to figure out what is the locus of blame, what is the locus of responsibility. um, that to me is the big challenge for the next, if we've got it, 10 years to try and solve this problem.
But this is the thing. I mean, we don't have that long. We don't
Yeah.
have long enough to find the locus of response. Like that's the situation that we've gotten into now.
Yeah.
If we could just find that sweet spot of presenting whatever the relationship exactly is between consumer and supplier and between individual versus network of individuals. And maybe also stop like anthropomorphizing companies and all this sorts of stuff. But we don't have the time.
Yeah.
So, like, what's it gonna take? Is it gonna take some radical politicians getting voted in? Is it gonna take coups,
Yeah.
military coups? And then also the other scary thing is if you imagine kind of the people on the other side, the activists who are rightly shouting about the crisis that we're in, their solutions as well don't really provide a blueprint for saving the economy, and therefore saving lives. And
Yeah.
it's so complex, the issue.
I mean, we've got a little time, so we
Let's
could
get
try
into
to flesh out a few different things. Um, a number of years ago, I reviewed Bill McKibben's second book on climate was called Earth, EAARTH. The idea being EAARTH was this planet that we now live in. We no longer live on Earth. We live in Earth.
it.
And in Earth, already the dynamics that uh, are the future of our climate are already irrevocably in place. And so that so much going forward will have to be a certain degree of adaptation. At the same time, he never yielded in the idea that we need to take really strong positive action going forward. And I remember, so I read this book and I had to review it for the New York Times. And it's McKibben is a very good writer. I don't know if you've read his work, The End of Nature. I mean, he's a big over here in the States anyway. He's a big activist. He's sort of the most recognizable name of climate activism in the United States. And at the end of the book, he did this thing that we all of us nonfiction writers end up getting asked to do by the publisher. Um, the publisher inevitably reads your depressing account,
Mm,
80,000 word account, and says, "Well, can't you throw in some solutions? Can't
mm,
you throw the reader a bone?" And what McKibben did at the end of Earth was, suggesting oh, we could, decentralize agriculture. We could, there was just this list of things that to me were very familiar. I'm sure they'd be very familiar to you. But at the end of the review that I wrote, I said it's almost as if we need an environmental Lenin, somebody like Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, to make this thing happen. A cruel, uh, hapless, not hapless, a cruel but just driven,
yeah.
relentless spokesperson for the earth. And is that the form of a revolution? I don't know. The question is, I think the reason Lenin was able to succeed was that he had the wind of hunger at his back, and the possibility of deliverance from hunger and suffering. Could a potentate take power with the wind of climate and climate change at their back? I'm not sure. Would we want such a person in charge? I'm not sure. But as you say, it could be one of those things that gets on the table. The thing though have you had anyone on the show talking about nuclear fusion?
No, not yet. But actually, I just have a quick
Yeah,
question
sure. We'll go back to
before we
fusion.
get into that.
Yeah.
We will go back into nuclear fusion. But what did your book look like before your publisher told you to put in some happy things?
Hmm. Well, it was a slightly different thing because McKibben's book is kind of more ambitious. It was a longer nonfiction narrative where he kind of took a whole accounting of everything that had taken place to date. My book, The Climate Diet, really was it kind of emerged in a way already as that list at the end of the book that the
Right.
publisher wanted to do. And it really came out of I did an op-ed for the New York Times called The New Year's Climate Diet. And it was just sort of looking at the fact that, the United States of all the industrial countries is the most sort of on an individual basis, the most climate obese in the sense
Mm-hmm.
that we're both a very big country, but also if you look at the total amount of emissions divided by the number of people that we have in the States, each person in the United States, theoretically bears a much larger per capita burden of what we're doing to the planet.
I think it's 16 times,
Yeah,
isn't it?
w- um, well, it's like it's 16 tons per person per year,
Yeah.
between 15 and 16 tons.
Mm.
And if you look at China, which is often um, pointed at today as the largest overall gross carbon emitter as a country, again, on a per capita basis, it's actually half of what it is in the United States.
Yeah.
And European countries, I think UK's around, what was it, 5 or 6 or something like that?
It's huge. Yeah, it's not as much as the USA, but UK, Europe, and USA absolutely take the biscuit and then turn
Yeah,
around and dictate to these other countries.
that's right. Yeah. And if you look at India, it's like 1.5 or
Mm,
1.7. What I
mm.
do think is interesting, this comes up in the climate diet, is that France is remarkably low. And,
Really?
yeah, they're around 3.1, 3.2, and they're, the UN has tended to look at around 3 tons per person per year as something that would bring us below that 2 degrees Celsius threshold. Um, the reason France has done that, and this will tie us back, is nuclear.
Yeah.
And, France went very big on nuclear very early on. They've continued to be big on nuclear. And it's funny. I think that we are faced with either acute risk or chronic destruction when it comes to nuclear. I
Mm.
think that we were all scared out of our pants by Fukushima. Um, Previous to that, you're much younger than I, but the 3 Mile Island disaster in the states, and then Chernobyl in the 80s. All those things combined to make the public deeply suspicious of nuclear energy. But when you think about what is potentially scalable quick enough in order to deal with the climate crisis, unfortunately or fortunately or whatever you want to say, it is atomic, it is nuclear.
Yeah.
Which is why the thought of nuclear fusion, which is opposed to fission, which is the the technology we have now is fission, but fusion poses to have way more potential power, and that could be the real game changer. To me, the more I think about it, the more I think that if you look at, say, the U.S. and the USSR in the late '60s in the space race, um, a very large portion of the GDP was put into getting people into space and onto the moon. Um, a similar kind of effort toward achieving nuclear fusion might be our only best chance as a species to get to the point. Because if we could achieve nuclear fusion, then all these questions and conversations that we're having would just become academic.
Well, I'm not sure if I completely agree with that because ultimately it would just give us more time. So these things it would give us time to be academics again when facing the issue. To then implement this, different solutions. And I think that this is kind of the long-termism versus short-termism. Like, we do need something now, but
Yeah,
the thing that we use now doesn't have to be the thing that we use forever.
right.
And surely it wouldn't be ever.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's funny. Going back to the wind farm question, this was something that came up a lot when I was talking with fishermen who were about to be displaced by these wind farms. I always thought that you'd put the wind farm in and you'd be done. But the wind farms only last 20 years.
Mm,
And then they get decommissioned and then you have to redo the whole thing.
yeah.
So talk about a solution that maybe is kind of short term and we need something longer term. I guess what I'm saying when I talk about nuclear fusion, I'm just saying that in terms of if we're really serious about really trying to address this, then a certain um, major portion of the West or of the developed world's budget really should be put towards the development of this technology.
Yeah.
Because here I do disagree. I'm not sure if we're in agreement or we're in disagreement, but all the numbers that I've looked at in terms of nuclear fusion tell me that that could be the fix.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you just have to look at that average with France using 3.1 tons per person.
Yeah.
And what I find particularly interesting about it, and I think that could be spun as a PR move to make everybody excited about nuclear again. In France, they drive cars, they still use, their petrol to get from A to B.
Yeah.
They still use polyester, they still use plastics, they still have the way of life that everybody is really reticent to give up.
Yeah.
But because they use nuclear to kind of fuel the country rather than the individuals,
Mhm.
they can afford that. They can
Mm.
afford, the net thing, even though I don't buy it at all. It does sort of balance out temporarily, at
Mhm.
least. And I mean, there's been no issues in France for ever with nuclear.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I haven't done a deep dive on it, but I don't know. There's no Chernobyl of France, as so far as
No,
I know.
no, 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 no. There isn't. I lived in France for 5 years, and nuclear was never really like a conversation or should we shouldn't be. And it was never a moral thing. It was just
Yeah,
it was being used, and if it was that versus fossils, then they were kind of happy to be the people trialing it. Quite frankly.
yeah. Well, I mean, France gave us the meter, you know, and so many of the sort of I think the technocracy of the modern world we owe a lot to France,
Hmm.
and they are often quick to develop. I always remember one of my favorite French inventions. I remember in was it like maybe 1991, 92? I went to France and I was speaking with my friend Carole, and I was like, "Well, what movie shall we see?" And she said, "Oh, we look it up on the Minitel." I'm like, "What's qu'est-ce que c'est le Minitel?" "Oh, le Minitel," and it was like this little tiny computer it was the internet, it was the web in 1991.
You're
Um,
joking.
and you could go on the Minitel and you look it up and it's very nice. It connects. They had the whole thing already worked out. And it was really strange. And of course, American technology zoomed ahead and replaced it. But I remember my brother is a screenwriter in Hollywood and we worked on a sci-fi TV show for a little while. And we had one episode of the show that the producers killed, but I always thought it was funny. It was going to be sort of like the hero uh, vis-a-vis the Matrix. He like jacks into the net because there's this artificial intelligence that is wreaking havoc all over the world, and they don't
Uh-huh.
know what. So finally, he goes into the net, and he meets the artificial intelligence. It turns out the artificial intelligence was spawned from the Minitel, and it's this arrogant, angry French
Ah!
artificial intelligence that's embedded in the web, and it's got this huge chip on its shoulder, and that's why it's messing up everything. And the way that the hero eventually disables it is he starts asking it lots of questions about how do you get from A to B on the Paris metro. It's, oh, is it easy? You go into Ariel and you switch it. But needless to say, the producer killed that. In a later day, maybe they would have allowed that to get through. But anyway, we digress. Back to to France and technocracy and nuclear energy. I just do think that we need to take a look at it. And I mean, I was the first, would have been with everyone else, with Jane Fonda and the China Syndrome. Again, these are movies that precede you by numbers of years. But I would embrace those. I mean, I would. It's worth a rethink and a relook at all of these kinds of things. I think the nuclear technology that has failed us, we have to keep in mind, was developed in almost space race speed.
Hmm.
The Soviet Union trying to get things up to speed as quickly as possible, industrializing Japan, trying to go from a rural society to a technocracy really, really quickly. None of this was done at a measured pace. But I do think that now, if we could consider a more measured pace about doing it with safety protocols and so forth in place, it's worth not being knee jerk about it.
Definitely. It's about reframing the problem, isn't it?
Yep.
We can either do that and maybe, yes, have some acute risk, but also bearing in mind the nation that has been managing nuclear for decades has had no issues.
Yep.
Versus, if we continue the way that we are, Jakarta is going to be underwater
Right.
in 10 years. And then that's hundreds of millions dead.
That's right. That's right.
And it's not even utilitarian. It's just like, surely there's only a couple of ways that we can go now because we've sort of backed ourselves into a corner.
Yep. I mean, and this brings us back to the question of who's going to rule this transition, who's going to run it. And sometimes I think, in a way, I mean, as you pointed out in my biography, I have a lot of resistance to technology and to the technologification of day to day life. And I,
Hmm.
have quit my iPhone. I wrote a book called Goodbye Phone, Hello World. And I do believe in the direct darshan, the eye to eye contact with nature is really revitalizing from a spiritual point of view. But when it comes to all of these like technocratic decisions that have to be made to get us to a carbon good place,
Mm.
this is almost, I feel like, needs to be run by an AI. You know what I mean? Like these decisions about which technologies we should pursue, it's a little bit like the self-driving car, that people
Mm.
worry about it, that it will kill the driver
Yeah.
because it'll do a calculation to figure out the maximum number of people who would survive in a crash situation.
Mm.
In a way, human reasoning and human logic doesn't seem up to the task of the global energy transformation.
And yet,
And yet,
and yet, we have options. And we have people who are intelligent enough who are working right now. I interviewed Nate Higgins, and he was talking about the difference between specialists and generalists,
mhm,
and how essentially we have a whole world of specialists, which is fantastic, but now we need generalists to pin between them and kind of pull things together and say this is an interlocking system of things that we can move forward with. Because right now it's like, oh well, if X then Y, okay, yeah, nuclear, but people might die. So it seems that we have solutions, but I would argue that the problems we face in terms of implementing these solutions, it's not human logic, it's greed,
mm,
it's lobbying powers, it's vested interests, it's the world being a certain way and changing it would, destabilize power. I have somebody I speak with about this kind of stuff who frequently says the powers that be don't want the world to change because this is how they're going to bring back the aristocracy.
oh, could be. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, one thing that's been on my mind lately. So my son, I have a 15-year-old who's studying, who's doing what we call advanced placement European history. It's a way of basically placing out of having to do a course in college. You do it in high school. So
Wow, at 15?
well, it's pretty common. Keep in mind this is national, so it's for the average person to place out of European history at the average university. So, like at
Okay.
Harvard, inshallah, where he will go. Uh, I jest, but he would probably still have to take European history. But
Right.
if he was going to go to Podunk State, he would have to take Anyway, the reason I'm doing this is that I'm finding I am the history tutor of record. My partner is the math tutor of record. I'm the history tutor of record, and we're really stuck and we're mired deep in the Protestant Reformation right now.
Okay.
And I never like you must have remember going through this in school, and it's a slog, and like, oh, what does this have to do with me? And da 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 da. But it suddenly occurred to me I was actually reading a draft book by my friend Carl Safina, who's a really great ecologist, and I was saying to Carl yesterday, actually, that what we really need is the equivalent of Martin Luther's 95 Thesis. Like, do you remember that from your history classes where Martin Luther, really at risk to his own life, nailed it on the door of the
Mm.
church, these 95 reasons why the Catholic Church sucked, um, and why it needed to change. And then following that was over 100 years of war and strife on the continent to try and and in the UK to try and work this whole thing out. That, when you talk about an ingrained institution that has no investment in change, ain't nothing better than the Catholic Church for that. Because when you
Mm.
think about it, this is an institution that owned and controlled lands all over Europe,
Mm-hmm.
that had a fixed income, basically built on serfdom and tithes and all these kinds of things. And here was this guy coming along who's just a lowly preacher who said, no, this is totally wrong. And this is totally against the nature of God. In this case, what we need is the 95 Thesis nailed on I don't know, the wall of, on the message boards of all of the bulletin boards of all of the internet places in the world, all the sites in the world, saying that the way that we've organized society today is intensely and intrinsically out of sync with peace, love, understanding, happiness, sustainability, and everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a revolutionary statement that has to be made, and it has to, in some way, it has to hit at the heart of things, and it has to cause wide scale disruption. The closest person I can think of who's doing that is Greta Thunberg, but
Mm.
you know, is she being taken seriously? Is she just some sort of plaything of the international NGO community? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, question a society that would, push a child to become their frontman rather than taking the heat themselves.
Yeah.
Um, I think what's really interesting in everything you've just said is that we never hear talk of how, apart from in the most radical of activists, who, funnily enough, are often ignored, but how a post-carbon world could be a better world.
Hmm.
It could be more equitable. It could be more sustainable. It could be more natural. People could work less. If consumption wasn't the driving factor in everything that we do, and capitalism as well. Um, and I think that that is where we need to push. It needs to become a dream, because that was the thing. He nailed that on the door, and that was essentially saying, "This is wrong in the eyes of God. This is not what God imagines." It's really ideological. It's really powerful. People can get behind that.
Hmm.
Um, there's not really an ideology for people to get behind right now. It's more like, oh, the world's on fire, but I don't want to give up my way of life. And it's not even so as conscious as I feel like I shouldn't have to. I mean, how are you meant to change your life? How are you meant what are you meant to give up exactly? And what would that look like? So giving people the dream of like a post-carbon vision,
Hmm.
that could be what changes policy.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, and I think, in a weird way, COVID, um,
Mm,
opened the door slightly. I mean, I don't know if it's happening in the UK, but there's a mass amount of office work. Many people are just quitting their jobs. And
yeah,
I
I've
think,
seen that.
and I think that's somewhat indicative of feeling like this whole system that we've set up for ourselves is not really driving happiness at all. There's a very good book. Well, there's a very good bad book that I often think about called Ecotopia,
Okay.
and it was written in the 70s. And the idea is that Northern California, Oregon, and Washington State, secede from the United States, and they create this this ideal state called Ecotopia. And it's all told it's kind of a Gulliver's Travels story where a reporter from New York gets the first Ecotopian visa, and he's sent on a reporting assignment to see how the Ecotopians live. And the Ecotopians live, as you say, they're very, they live a really great life. They're like, it brings a little tear to my eye, I have to say, when I talk about it. But, there's a lot more placed on the communal, a lot more placed on the relaxing side of life. And, it, but as you say too, and as your guest who comes on your show says, there is this um, desire to go backwards and return to aristocracy, which, if you want to go one sphere out bigger than that, is really a lot about humans as hierarchical animals, that were built in our DNA and in our social structures that evolved over hundreds of, or over a million, over hundreds of thousands of years as hominids, let's say. That we have this biology driving us towards status, towards showing that we're better than other like creatures. And so
Mm.
that's a pretty hard thing to fight against, but it's certainly important.
Unfortunately, I haven't read it yet. Otherwise, I'm sure I'd be able to come back with some data. But right over there is the Dawn of Everything, or A New Dawn of Everything,
Uh-huh.
by David Graeber and
Yep.
David Winrow. And from what I understand so far, from this few pages I've read, they're essentially challenging that hierarchical theory. They've, to prove that there is um humanity is a collaborative species at its core,
Mhm.
not competitive. Otherwise, we would have never gotten to the place that we are today. And I spoke to a biophysical economist who said the exact same thing. We weren't talking about the book, but he was saying that if, even on the level of like our gut biome,
Mhm.
we are in relationships with all of these little creatures that are not us, but are independent to us physically. But without them, we would die.
Yep.
We're an ecosystem within an ecosystem within an ecosystem. Da, da, da. And he said it just proves that nature is collaborative, and also we are collaborative on a biological level, on a psychological level. Da, 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 da. And he was arguing, if we could just change the narrative, could we
Mhm.
change the policy?
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think as journalists, that's sort of where we land in all of this, like what we can do. Because I mean, I'm sure you believe in the power of storytelling.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, I mentioned Carl Safina earlier. So I'm a fellow with this institute, and he often says that it's not data that changes minds. It is stories. It's things that speak to the heart.
Hmm.
And so yeah, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I thought that stories weren't powerful.
We should go back to fish, I feel.
Well, well,
Just,
yeah,
I mean,
sure,
we've got what, about 10-ish minutes, and
sure,
this started with, I introduced you to a fish expert, and then we just stopped talking about them.
yeah. Well, I think writers are always forever trying to, I think, do something else than they feel they're stuck doing. David Mamet, American playwright, once famous. Well, I don't know if he famously said, but I read a book. I was writing something about Vermont, and there was a series of books assigned on the American states, and he was got assigned Vermont. And he said the writer, having received a commission to write a book about Vermont, finds himself thinking of Ohio. You know,
Yeah,
so
of
I
course.
I always feel with fish, I keep trying to move off that subject, but I keep kind of getting brought back in. But going back to trying to maybe to merge the fish and the climate question,
Mm,
um, I do think that fish and the ocean and what people are calling the blue economy are a really potentially great way to address some of our issues around food production
mhm,
for the future. So a lot of potential in things like seaweed, kelp, mussels, clams, oysters. All of those creatures are very low in carbon emissions to get to the table, but they also do like great things biologically. You know, um, Mussels, clams, oysters, seaweed. They all create structure that creates more habitat, more edge, potentially enriching biodiversity on the planet. Um, the terrestrial agriculture overloads the ocean with nitrates, and it's precisely things like seaweeds and mussels and so forth that can remove those nitrates from the water column and put them to good use. So I think rethinking how a lot of people are sort of anti-aquaculture. I'm not one of those people. I think that it's really which species we choose to make the focus of our aquaculture of the future could be, could be a game changer. And then I also think, rebuilding, if we were to rebuild wild species past back to their um, pre-exploitation levels, then the general consensus among fishery scientists is that we could have another 20 to 30 million metric tons of wild seafood per year. So
Mm.
so there's a lot of potential there that I don't think we're necessarily realizing quite yet.
And is it possible? Because I think when most of us think of the oceans and the problems in the ocean, it's like, the temperatures rising
Hmm.
and the corals bleaching.
Hmm.
And without the corals, certainly the message that I've gotten in documentaries and articles is like, it's sort of game over. Are we close to game over in the
No, I
oceans?
mean, the thing is, the oceans still produce 80 to 90 million metric tons of seafood per year, and or both fish and shellfish per year. And when you think about it, that's the human weight of China produced every single year. So I'm going to pick up
Sorry.
this photo, and then I'm going to actually I'm just going to unplug this. Um, uh, but we get a tremendous amount of stuff from the sea, in spite of everyone saying that the oceans are dead. So there's like a tremendous,
Mm.
tremendous amount of vitality still left in the ocean. Um, yes, coral bleaching is a thing, but if we were to lose all the coral reefs in all the world, that would primarily affect the tropics. I mean, there's still substantial productivity in the temperate zones where coral is not even really part of the ecosystem. So it's very hard to make a very broad generalization about all the oceans because all the oceans represent so many different
Mm.
ecosystems overall. The bigger concern is ocean acidification, which that when you start to talk about undermining the very base levels of all marine systems, like on planktonic level, and many plankton form calciferous shells. So if we lose plankton, yes, that is a game over situation. But I don't think we're there yet. And I think that, again, it's whether the oceans, there goes us. And it's one more reason to really address the carbon issue very seriously because ocean acidification is a direct result of excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
Okay, so for the people listening, if there's if there's fish that they should be avoiding and fish that they should be eating, what is it?
Oh boy. Well, in terms of eating, I'm always an advocate for things like anchovies and sardines. The vast majority of these small, what are called forage fish, get caught and ground up and fed to salmon or chickens or pigs. Um, the biggest fishery in the world is the Peruvian anchoveta. Sometimes as much as 5 or 10 million metric tons of fish per year. Those fish, 99% of them go to livestock feed. So eating those
Oh,
directly, if possible, to me is a thing that we should be doing more of. And I mentioned already mussels, clams, oysters, and seaweeds are all good choices. In terms of things that can be avoided or should be avoided, I think bottom trawled species like sole or flounder, not ideal. I mean, there are ways of catching those in pots. So if there's an option to eat pot caught fish like that, that is probably a good thing to do.
and bottom trawls when they drag the
When
net across the
they're
seabed.
literally dragging the bottom and disrupting the benthos as they
Right.
go. So I think that's a practice that we need to figure out a way around going forward. There are some bottom ecosystems that can maintain that better than others, like a sandy bottom that trawling sounds like a bad day at the beach, um, but
Or a good day.
um, but but avoiding bottom trawled species is probably a good idea. Sadly, I would say it's probably time to avoid anything caught in the Mediterranean because there's something like more than 20 different countries surround the Mediterranean, and it's very hard to reach fishing accords among those different nations. I have an article in French in the magazine Geo that's coming out this month, where we look. Part of it is about the Mediterranean, but it's more like it's not necessary. It's not always a question coming down to species. It comes down to which nations and which bioregions have the rule of law in place and decent management in place. And not to toot my country's own horn, but the United States historically has been a good manager of its fisheries. Australia quite good, New Zealand quite good. The UK suffers from ongoing disputes with its neighbors.
Mhm.
Um, So that is a very complicated nutshell in which I could summarize things. So there are certain creatures that you can always eat, like anchovies, mussels, clams, and oysters, and then there are certain bioregions that we have to avoid, like the Mediterranean.
All right. And I have to ask because they're really popular and I need to know for myself.
Yeah.
Salmon and tuna.
So again, you're speaking of a basket of species when you mention those names. And in
Okay.
fact, it's, when I wrote my book for fish, salmon and tuna are two of the fish, but they actually
Yeah.
are fishes. There are 23 different species out there that fall under the rubric of tuna, and
Right.
there are at least 6 species that fall under the rubric of salmon. Um, I, I tend to, if you're going to have tuna um, in a can, I tend to favor chunk light, which has to be skipjack tuna and pole caught if you can get it. Um, when it comes to salmon, there are some very interesting and good farmers of salmon out there, but because I live in the States and because we have very healthy populations of wild sockeye salmon, I always emphasize people to try to get wild salmon on their plate. I think actually in the UK, the majority of the tinned salmon that you're getting over there is going to be wild salmon from Alaska, sometimes from Russia
Okay.
as well. But tinned sockeye, also called red salmon, is probably your best choice when it comes to salmon. Sometimes frozen portions as well, but I don't know what the fish market scene is in the UK at the
All
moment.
right. Well, some good news there.
Yeah.
Hope, lots of hope, nuclear fusion and, fish.
Hopefully not in the same kennel.
So I should call the episode Nuclear Fusion and Fish.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And we've gone to places in this interview that don't necessarily go to in the writing that I've done so far, but it's not the last writing that I'll do, and
Hmm.
who knows what will be next.
Excellent. Paul, thank you so much for your time. It was such a pleasure to speak with you on all of these topics. I have one final question. Who would you like to platform?
Mm. Well, I certainly would love to platform Carl Safina,
Okay.
um, because I think that he is he's was first known in the States for a book called "Song for the Blue Ocean," but he did successfully make the migration out of the sea, much like our predecessors millions of years ago. But he wrote a great book called "Beyond Words: What Animals Think and Feel,"
Oh, wow.
and then another follow up to that called "Becoming Wild." And he is very much of the mind that we're giving short shrift to animals by kind of causing a duality between that there's us and them,
Hmm.
but when really we're all part of the same evolutionary process. So platform him away.
Amazing. I will track him down.
Good.
Thank you so, so, so much.
Really fun speaking to you as well, Rachel.
If you want to learn more about Paul's work and find his books, I'll put links to his website over on planetcritical.com, where you can choose a paid subscription to support this podcast. Thank you all for listening and for your support. See you next week.